Hello, everyone. I'm Bill Wolpin. I'm the Associate Publisher and Editorial Director of American City and County, and your moderator for today's webinar, What is Strategic Asset Management and Why Should I Care? This webinar is brought to you by Dude Solutions. Before we get going, let me explain how you can get the most out of this event. You can improve your viewing and listening experience by moving your webcast windows around by dragging on the title bar or resizing them by clicking on their lower right corner. At the bottom of your screen, you're going to find multiple application widgets. These buttons allow you to open and close widgets on your screen. Of course, we welcome your questions about our topic. We're going to answer as many as we can following the presentation. But feel free to submit your questions to the queue at any time. Here's how you do it. Just type it into the Q&A window on the left-hand side of your screen and hit the Submit button. Please also be aware that today's session is being recorded and will be available on demand for viewing. You're going to be notified by email when that archive is available. Now let me introduce today's speakers. Akshay Prabhu is Vice President of Strategic Asset Management with Dude Solutions. He has over 20 years experience in strategic asset management and was the co-founder of Ascetic, which was recently acquired by Dude Solutions. Joining Akshay today will be Chris Sewell, who is the Facilities Division Manager for the City of Wichita, Kansas. Chris has more than 20 years experience in the commercial construction and energy efficiency industry. You can find more information about Akshay and Chris by clicking on the Speaker Bio widget at the bottom of your screen. Now with that, let's go ahead and get started. Akshay, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Bill. Overcoming infrastructure issues, why strategic asset management is critical. I'm assuming you can see the slide called Agenda. Can I get a confirmation on that, please?
Yes.
Yeah, so today we will discuss strategic asset management from a long-term planning perspective and look at, from a government perspective, from infrastructure perspective, what does long-term planning mean in relation to life cycle of assets, and very privileged to have Chris Sewell here from the city of Wichita providing a case study around how this is really applied on the ground in terms of communication, collaboration, and having a long-term plan that enables any government entity to reduce future risk as well as improve future service levels. And then, of course, we will head into an open Q&A with audience questions, comments, and have a more interactive discussion. But before we start, let's just have a quick poll question, which you should all see on your screen now. And you have the opportunity to participate in this poll, and we can publish the results pretty much straight away as soon as this question has been answered. And the question is, what best describes your organization's asset management planning? Option 1, we don't have asset management plans. Option 2, we do have asset management plans, but they're now 2 years old or more. And option 3 is we do have asset management plans, but they are 5 or more years old. We will take another 5 seconds before we move to the poll results. Let's have a look. So a fairly distributed audience group, about a third don't have asset management plans, and the 2/3 that do have about a third where the asset management plans are more than 5 years old. And this is very typical of a lot of the international audience groups or population in the asset management industry, and fairly reflective of what's happening currently in the infrastructure world. Just to give you a little bit of an idea of the type of background we will cover today, whilst what we discuss today is relevant to all types of infrastructure, Chris will particularly deep dive into the detail on behalf of one of the largest city in Kansas, with a significant volume of buildings, a significant volume of streets, underground drainage, water, sewage, etc., and focus on one or two of those asset types to give us a really good view on how strategic asset management can provide value, reduce future issues from a life cycle planning perspective. And when you go through Chris's presentation and particularly look at the theory of financial planning, life cycle costing, it really relates to these questions that are fundamentally now very critical as a lot of the Western economies around the world get into a phase of future planning. What is my future budget going to be looking like? What is the current health or the condition of my assets? Am I in control of the future with my operational costs? Do I understand risk? What is our backlog? What sort of capital works plan do we need to put into place? Do we understand how our assets perform? Do we have an asset management plan? What does the 4-year capital works program look like? If I spent my money differently, can I get a different outcome? Can I reduce my future risk without necessarily spending more capital money? All of these questions constitute what would typically be the important elements of long-term financial planning. And why is financial planning really important? Why is infrastructure deficit really important to understand? Why does it matter and why should I care? Is really contained in this simple graphic. And if I can have all the audience just reflect on the fact that any infrastructure asset, whether it's a pipe or a building, or even the roof of a building, or a road pavement, or a sidewalk, or a plant and equipment, over a period of time, just like a human being, that piece of infrastructure will slowly degrade over time, typically called loss of capacity or loss of performance, driven by a number of factors until it gets to a point where, because of community angst or some level of condition or capacity or fitness for purpose, the organization chooses to renew it, replace it, or return it to its original service level. And applying strategic asset management means that the organization also uses choices to intervene earlier in some cases, given other intelligence and knowledge about the benefits of intervening early. Or it may simply be that because some of our assets provide a really high level of service, we will intervene early to always keep them in a significantly better state. And all of this hits at the heart of strategic asset management, because as our assets start to get into the D phase or the E phase, which is typically a condition 4 or a 5 in that 0 to 6 scale that you see there. The D or the E phase, really the rate of consumption starts to significantly increase, and it's increasing beyond our capacity to pay for its replacement. And that's the catch. And that's the absolute pivotal, fundamental issue with life cycle planning, is when our capacity to replace what is getting consumed is significantly less than what is getting consumed, then we get what is typically called an infrastructure deficit. And the American report cards from ASCII demonstrate majority of the infrastructure being somewhere between a D plus and an E minus, in some cases even beyond an E, which is reflective of the fact that infrastructure deficit is creeping every 3, 5, 10 years. And that doesn't mean every bridge, every sidewalk, every building is in a D or a E. What it means is predominantly out of the tens of thousands of assets that we individually are custodians of, there is a high level of risk that 2, 3, or 4% of those assets now start to appear into this high risk zone between a D and an F. And when that happens, the problem of strategic asset management really needs to be resolved. But what does that mean? It also means that as assets wear out, our annual maintenance cost also significantly increases, and therefore our future infrastructure gap also significantly starts to creep. And the game we're in is reducing this gap and planning for the infrastructure as custodians of this billions and billions of dollars of infrastructure. Our job as practitioners is to ensure that either funds are available or a mechanism is in place to trade off, or we're in a position to have conversation with our stakeholders or the community to demonstrate the future needs in order to deliver a financial plan that is sustainable. So there's a number of ways organizations around the world do their budgeting. And let's reflect on what we might be doing at the moment. How do we budget for our buildings, our sidewalks, our facilities, our road pavements, etc.? Is it the typical depreciation or amortization method, which is 10 times last year's depreciation, and that gives us a 10-year plan? Or is it simply forecasting the future based on the past and saying, as long as I've got somewhere between plus or minus 5% of what I've had, we should be okay. And if we are or not okay, we'll find out when we get there. Or based on future needs, which is some of the concepts of strategic asset management, which allows us to get a significantly better outcome without necessarily spending more, raising taxes, or necessarily have to reduce service levels. And from an example perspective, I've just picked up today a really simple asset type. It's a sidewalk in the middle of a fairly affluent city. Just as an example case, a high priority footpath or a sidewalk heading towards the entertainment center. And if you look at this sidewalk from an accounting perspective on the left-hand side of your screen, the engineering data which says the sidewalk is of a certain size and it's in condition 2, which is a B in the A to F scale, which means it's in pretty good nick. If you look at the financial aspects of that footpath, the register of the organization says it would cost $30,000 to replace that sidewalk if it got wiped out tonight. That's the replacement cost. Its build cost, however, which was 15 years ago, was only $12,000. And with an expected life of 50 years, from a financial perspective, the amortization is $30,000 divided by 50, which is $600 per annum. Really simple math, based on a straight line, no rocket science, looks at the current health of the footpath, estimates the remaining life, and says, I need about $600 a year to keep this footpath delivering its level of service. If, on the other hand, I was able to predict the life cycle of the footpath, and more importantly, for that particular one, because it's a high level of service, I was able to link its future to a service level plan that allows me to fund and articulate the money required based on how that footpath behaves over its life. So as you can see here, there is an initial acquisition cost, but there is also an ongoing maintenance and renewal cost of that sidewalk, which is articulated in my financial plan based on where in its life cycle, based on its condition or on its performance, I'm going to do some work on that particular sidewalk because it's delivering a high level of service. So this intervention here is very much linked to the fact that that sidewalk is delivering a high level of service. And therefore, when I look at the life cycle plan of this sidewalk, it's not $600 per annum averaged from an amortization perspective, but it's actually $1,450 per annum when I add all these ongoing costs of delivering that service level. And very similarly, from a life cycle planning perspective, if I changed my priority on that footpath, or if it indeed was a different footpath or sidewalk, this time it delivers a low level of service because it's got low pedestrian use and low risk. Now I've got a different life cycle model. I will still do work on that footpath or sidewalk, but only when it reaches a certain point in its life cycle. And I might in fact do a lower level of inspection and maintenance because it's delivering a lower level of service. So based on life cycle planning, I've now got a number of options of what that future financial forecast looks like, in this case, $520 per annum. So the reflection here as an asset management fraternity is to question the budgeting process that will allow us to have a sustainable and more defendable and accurate financial plan. For example, in this case, is the $1,450 more accurate than the $600 based on traditional amortization? Or in fact, a low service level based financial plan is more appropriate for this particular sidewalk? Or are we actually using amortization using historic cost as opposed to the current replacement cost, in which case we might be a long way away from the real forecast of what the long-term financial plan of that sidewalk looks like? So the question becomes, which of these is a more appropriate long-term financial plan? Which of these puts us more in control? And more importantly, when we have tens of thousands of assets competing with each other, some delivering a high service level, some delivering a low service level, how do we trade off and compete to deliver the best effective service level from a community perspective that is really reflective of what that community is going to consume in the future? And asset lifecycle planning enables us to achieve that, do those trade-offs, and remove the margin for error in our infrastructure deficit forecast, in the conversations that engineers can have with their departments and also with their finance teams, in the engagements that engineers and finance teams can have with their board or their councillors or their elected members or politicians, and ultimately how it gets debated, discussed, and rationalized with the community. And this all gets really more interesting when you've got facilities competing with underground drainage, and underground drainage competing with road pavements, and a limited amount of money which needs to be spent in the best possible long-term fashion. And that is the game of strategic asset management that takes us into the question of accountability. So whether it's the engineer that gets asked the question, or whether it's the finance controller that gets asked the question, they both have the one voice, the one answer when the question is something like, how much life is left in the roof? How much money do we need to repair it? How much life is left in all our sidewalks? How much money do we need over 10 years to make sure that we don't have risk in the future? What's the current state of our bridges? What will happen if I throw another $500,000 a year for the next 5 years at our bridges? What if I take that money out of somewhere else? What impact does that have on that somewhere else? Which is basically all about accountability to the ultimate user, whose future is where they're going to spend the rest of their life, and having a defendable plan about the city that we will provide as custodians. On that note, I will hand over to Chris to explain this in a pragmatic way, how the city of Wichita pioneered the concept of strategic asset management. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Ashay. So, this is where the rubber meets the road. This is probably the first time outside of a council meeting that what we did here in Wichita has been shared publicly. So hopefully I present it to you in a very convincing and educational manner. Photo you're looking at is our Keeper of the Plains, one of our many, many assets to maintain. What we're going to talk about today is just the facilities assets. And in order to start, we're going to go back 3 years when we were told we need to get a better picture of exactly what do we own, where is it, and what condition is it. So we hired out for a condition assessment to be done by some consulting engineers. We'll get into that here in a moment, but at the very bottom I want you to see that question. That question was posed to our staff by the council during a presentation for annual budget. Is how much money do you need to keep the doors open? Is what they wanted to know. And that was a question with the data we had at the time we could not answer. We headed down this road and show you how it went. First, we'll start with a traditional metric used across the industry, FCI. What I would mention here is FCI, keep in mind, is a financial metric. Financial only. It's the total cost of everything in your backlog divided by the total cost to rebuild all those buildings that contain your backlog. Now, also keep in mind that what makes up that number on the top, your numerator, FCI does not care what kind of asset that is. That's looking at dollars only. So it could be $1 million worth of carpet or $1 million of your fire sprinklers. And the target ranges below were what was given to us by the consulting engineers that they saw most clients tried to hit a 10% target FCI. And also that pretty much any building they saw get over 30% individually, you should probably take a hard look at it as to whether or not you even want to keep that building anymore, because it's fairly well gone financially. So when we presented this to council, and now you're seeing some of the slides from that presentation, we had to make FCI real because it's a esoteric concept. People need a point of reference as to what good means, what does average mean, what does poor mean. So we picked a building type that all council members have in their districts, fire stations. They've all been in one. Showed them a good fire station, doing towns look good. Showed them a fair fire station. Poor. This particular EPDM roof has had a lot of patches done to it. And critical. That particular fire station, there are portions of the building where I can see daylight from the inside. With that, we showed the council, all right, with the assessment that we had done, and granted we only had enough budget to assess 2/3 of our square footage, our overall FCI was poor. A quarter of the buildings were critical, about 30% FCI. You can see the backlogs and the asset value new there. Now that's only 2/3 of the assets. Remember, our full building portfolio, including the airport, is well over $1 billion. And this is where I would say a lot of organizations I've seen stop. To get to FCI, and the practitioners within the staff were asking for more budget to attack the deferred maintenance backlog. They have this condition assessment. They come to upper management, come to council and say, hey, we have a poor rating. We are told we should get to 10%. And if it's how our meetings went, they would say, well, what's the difference between 18 and 15? What does that get me? You know, it has to be something relatable to them. And just an FCI financial metric doesn't move the needle in their mind to make a decision for greater funding to attack that backlog. So recognizing that, we had to first break down the idea they had that FCI is a useful metric for future planning, which in my opinion it is not. It's good for benchmarking, but for planning how much money you need and where to spend it, what we did, we feel is a much better way to do that. And I'll give you an example, a real-world example that happened. This is the Wichita Ice Center. It has 2 rinks, an ammonia brine system, it's about 700 tons of cooling. It was built almost 25 years ago. Now, the important part here is it's leased by the city to a third party. And in that lease agreement, the third party is supposed to maintain the equipment. And any major capital needs that they have, they're supposed to contact the park department and have the park department relay that to the facilities department so we can get that fixed. However, 2 years ago, we got a phone call, and I'm going to show you a photo of what we walked into. There's that chiller system. It completely failed. It took us 9 months from the time to find money to replace it, to engineering, to bids, to construction, to get that back up and operational, because we had to replace everything. It was all pretty much ruined. And also we found out that there were no maintenance records kept by the owner-occupant, or the tenant in this case, which made our insurance claim a little dicey, but ultimately successful. So where am I going with this? FCI, it does not measure your risk at all. At the time that chiller failed, they had a 7% FCI rating on that building. The only thing was, what was in that 7% was awfully important. And you see the cost we incurred there, over $1 million to replace the system. Temporary chillers, those were $45,000 a month. We even had to pay to that company that was supposed to maintain the equipment $200,000 of lost business. So this was a $2 million project that should have been a $1 million project had it been properly planned. And also to pay for the replacement, I had to give up a $750,000 HVAC project to do City Hall's control system. So we lost the savings from that as well. So using FCI for forward planning, not the best thing. Now, once we broke that idea down, the second thing we had to accomplish was, how do we tell the facilities maintenance story to people that don't understand facilities maintenance? Now, before, when Asha was showing you the sidewalk example, there were some reports up there that came out of one of the software tools that we use. And what you're seeing here is a Microsoft Power BI dashboard that was built by a consultant for us that takes our simulations of assets and puts them in a format where I look and find which scenarios are the most favorable, which funding levels give us the best KPIs, and so forth. And on the left, you can see I can drill down by system, component type, anything I want. Now, if I showed this to the City Council and said, okay, this shows that 2 times increase in funding gives us a better priority score rating. You see in the lower right the weighted priority scores. Essentially what that is a consequence of failure score. We had a dry run where we presented that to upper management, and it devolved into a conversation where everyone wanted to go down the rabbit hole as to how did we build the consequence of failure score? How did each of them weighted? Did you try weighting all of them differently? To make a long story short, you want to give the decision makers a clear, succinct picture and very simple demonstration of what you're asking for and why it needs to happen. So Keep in mind this Power BI report that I see, and now you're going to see what I showed the city council. That's it. On your vertical axis, you're seeing the number of critical assets in City Hall that have 0 remaining service life. And using the CIP funding we had at the time, we had 2 different approaches we showed them. The current approach in the orange line is what would happen to those numbers of assets if we stayed on our current fix-on failure and just did whatever came first, what we had money to do with no prioritization applied. And then I ran a different decision logic for the model. Said, what if instead we focused that money on a critical asset? We did refurbishments on critical assets when they were at 20% remaining life, 10% remaining life. Took care of the important things first. And you'll see from the graph it drove down that number of assets that could fail. And we tied this back to the first slide, that first question I was talking about. How much do you need to keep the doors open? This was the slide that answered that question for them. But we're reducing the number of things that could fail and shut down this building by just spending our money differently. And in this slide, we're not even asking for any more money. This is just a modified approach to how we spend on those assets. And that resonated with them. Because now you're getting to how they see the buildings. Are they open or are they not? Are we getting complaints? Or am I getting emails? You know, find those points and answer them for the council. After our presentation, we gave them some financials and recommended amounts to maintain our system values. And after that, during council asked me a question, said, you know, in our CIP, we're replacing a couple of buildings coming up. Does your model consider that? To that, we answered, well, yes, we actually did run a scenario for that one. On your vertical axis, you're seeing the asset value. That's the full replacement cost of an asset times its percent remaining service life. The blue line, you're seeing the asset value of the entire fire department. That's 21 fire stations and a regional training center, with $400,000 every other year for maintenance. And you can tell plainly from that line that that's not enough money to keep up with your degradation. In the orange scenario, I went into the model and forced it to replace 5 fire stations over 10 years. Gave it the extra money to do so, but also gave it the exact same $400,000 every other year worth of maintenance money. So this image should very plainly show you that building new buildings doesn't change the slope of your degradation line. It merely shifts where you're going to be on that curve. The only thing that's going to change the slope of that value line is funding levels. And in subsequent other slides we had shown the council, we demonstrated that to them. So now I get to probably what I would say one of the more important slides, because it ties everything together. About 4 years ago, when I was asked to work on the condition assessment, which was odd considering I was the city's energy manager at the time, I knew the first thing I had to do was figure out, okay, well, what are we starting with? You know, the old adage, can't manage what you don't measure. Well, I got a list from our real estate department that said the city owned about 350 buildings, a little over 4 million square feet. And then come to find out when we did the actual assessment, and I combined lists from multiple different departments, it was really over 607 million square feet. And if I throw housing in there, it's almost 1,000 structures. And that's counting everything from City Hall down to a garden shed, but they all count. So the first thing you need to take care of is, well, you own it. Where is it? And how do you do that? Facility condition assessment. Got to have an asset database somewhere. And if you can, make sure every single department in your organization uses the same one. You have one version of the truth. Now that you have that, those 2 questions in step 2, how do you minimize risk, maximize remaining service level, and do it within your constrained budget? Those were questions that could not be answered by a condition assessment and a list of prioritized elements. We had to go down the optimization, strategic asset management route in order to answer those questions. And only in answering those questions did we convince council enough to begin to really listen to us. Now, after you run your scenarios, you spit out a report that says, okay, in all these simulated years, here's all the projects my simulation says you should do. Take that and ad hoc, by hand, everyone's CIP process is different. You start to build out your CIP. Now, we don't even do exactly every project that shows up in every single year. Because, granted, degradation curves are averages, as our equivalent useful lifespan. So we know on the ground certain assets may be in worse shape than others. And we build that CIP manually. And after that takes place, then it gets kicked over to our computerized maintenance management system and portfolio project management, your work orders and project software. So now you go out and execute, build. And another key step is going from step 4 back to step 1. I've heard this over time called the cradle-to-cradle method. Once you figure out a way in your work order closeout and your project closeout to update your asset database, then you have a continuously updated facility condition assessment. And to give you an idea of how we organized our data, starting at the top and drilling down, this was the hierarchy that we came up with. It took us about, on top of everything else we were working on, about a month, talking through roofing assets specifically, to come up with this list on the asset hierarchy. Now, the reason we broke out buildings and site assets from class is because we didn't want site assets, like a bad parking lot, to mess up a building's FCI score. So thinking a little ahead as to what your reporting is going to look like will inform how you want to set up your data in the front end. And then on down to the, not sure who's clicking backwards for me. There we go. This is where our level of analysis is currently. It's at the element level. Our condition assessment, remember, was 2/3 of our assets, had 12,000 elements in it. And one element could be every lighting fixture inside City Hall. Now, where we're going with this program, as I'm implementing a new work order system right now and how the assets are being recorded in it, we're going there. Which means one line in the old database will now become 7,000 lines because we put every single individual lighting fixture into it. It adds a degree of complexity, but also it's a degree I think is worth it to go down. And this slide, I just want to address a topic that came up when we were developing these tools. The city of Wichita has developed a number of modeling and analysis tools in Excel over the past decade. And in those, they were a little more simplistic because they had to be in order for Excel to handle it. So the question they posed to me is, why couldn't we just calculate every single permutation or possibility with your data set? And in here, I explained to them, look, if all you looked at was replacing something or not, and we only looked at 120 different assets, the number of ways you could do that is an astronomical number. So you kind of have to go down the algorithm path to get a statistically close answer to what the exact right solution is. There are other tools that use Excel. One of them in particular, if you want to run a scenario and then change it, well, you're going to be waiting until the next day. Whereas with the tool that we developed for facilities, 2 minutes there is for the full data set. If I'm doing something for City Hall, I'll have that 40-year simulation done in less than 30 seconds. So you can rapidly work your way through all different sorts of funding scenarios, different decision logics. We came up with 24 different decision logics alone. And those were, how do you take care of your assets? Is it fix on failure for everything? Is it proactive replacements for critical assets, but fix on failure for non-critical assets? Is it, some other variation of those? And we also had almost 30 degradation curves to our assets across 77 component types. It's a very large and complex data set, much more so when we're done than even the utilities we have within the city. Much more complex than those. So after we made that presentation to council, and this was last February, everyone knows what happened February, March this year. Everyone's working from home. There's problems with the economy. But even with that, and we have a projected $50 million shortfall over the next 3 years coming, even with that, last month, council approved basically all of our requests for increases to the maintenance budget because we finally translated it into a language they understood. And with that, I will kick it back to Ashley.
Thank you, Chris, for that practitioner view. So why is this all important, and why for us as practitioners around the table, custodians of infrastructure, this is so important from a thought leadership perspective, is with a looming infrastructure deficit that constantly seems to grow, with increased participation in determining ways to plug that deficit without necessarily spending more money, or like Chris pointed out, using metrics that enable decision makers to increase or trade off funding. There are a number of state bodies and organizations that are now taking a real interest in this piece. Particularly in North America, we are finding the Accounting Standards Board, GASB, PSAB, MFOA in Canada, are really taking a 25-year view on budgeting, a 10-year view on capital planning, and a 4-year view, the traditional 4-year view on where the projects get done. And that shift is fundamentally to bring the accounting and the engineering fraternity together in terms of using data and evidence to demonstrate long-term impacts of short-term decisions. Planning with multiple future options, which basically means my option for the future is not just last year plus or minus 5%. I've now got the ability to see 5 versions of my future city, or see 10 versions of my future water network, to be able to then decide which one I want to spend the rest of my life in, and then from that, work out how my money currently that I've got actually gets invested. With COVID and a lot of the stimulus funding, again, strategic asset management becomes a really great tool to be able to demonstrate that long-term impact of short-term decisions. So with that, and conscious of time, we now go to our second poll question, which is an interesting one. This is not about whether we have an asset management plan and what was its currency. This is more about how far do we as an organization currently plan for our financial life cycle planning on our infrastructure, for our long life assets, our pavements, our streets, our pipes, our buildings. Do we plan out 1 year, 1 to 5 years, 5 to 10 years, 10 to 20 years? Or do we actually embrace a 20-plus year planning horizon to be able to look at future impacts from a community perspective? Well, I'm sure you've all had a chance to answer that one. So we will submit that and look at the polling results. And quite interestingly, no one is in the 20+ year group. About 20% in the 10 to 20 years, which is terrific to see. And majority are 75% is less than 10 years. But it's that shift from 5 to 10 to 10 to 20 is really where GASB and PSAB are pushing, both from a regulation perspective as well as good practice perspective, exactly like what happened in Australia and New Zealand 15 years ago, is bringing that accounting and engineering fraternity together to look at asset management, not just 3 or 4 years down the track, but 10, 15, 20 years down the track to understand the impacts. On that note, I will now hand over to the Q&A portion of this webinar. So I'll hand it back over to Bill and Earl. And I really thank everyone for the opportunity for Chris and I to be able to present today.
Thank you very much, Ashay. This is Bill. And to the audience, we have a handful of questions here we'd like to get to. The first one looks like it's directed to Chris. What is the best advice for you to have for an agency at the very beginning of the journey, particularly in regard to data collection and mapping?
I think you want to think back to that chart I showed that had the 4 steps on it. Remember, I thought those concepts out before we even began, really, the condition assessment. And this really gets to an axiom I've followed for a long time from my construction days. You need to know you're finished before you start. And in that, you need to know, well, what is your goal here? Well, you need to, improve on your deferred maintenance backlog. Okay, well, how are you going to get there? Well, we need more funding. All right, how are you going to get more funding? Well, I need council to approve it. Okay, what will convince council to give you more money? Which is what I went through in my presentation. We had to figure out what those points were that they needed to hear that would turn that trigger for them. And then also with your data, you need to understand that how you want to report your data out is going to dictate what kind of data you need to collect on the front end in order to accomplish that, and what data you don't need to collect, what would be useless to you. For instance, when we were collecting data on rooftop HVAC units, one of the things that was suggested to us to collect was dimensions or the curb size. And I said, what does that have to do with capital planning? Nothing, so we didn't collect it. But I did want to know if that was hot water, gas, or electric heat, or what tonnage range that unit was in, because that changed what kind of asset treatments I could do to that rooftop. Those were useful inputs. Anything that can really change what kind of action you can do to an asset or change how you report out, those are the key ones you want to hone in on for data points to collect on the front end. But as always, start with a clear picture of where you want to end up and work backwards from there.
Great. Hold on a sec here. Let me get to the next question. Here we go. Let's see. Here we go. This one's also for Chris. Looks like it. What is a reasonable amount of time for my agency to expect start seeing ROI from the investment in SAM? How long until Wichita had usable outputs?
Okay. Well, if you're starting from nothing, our condition assessment, if you add in the time it took to do RFP, select someone, have them go out and assess about 4 million square feet of buildings, that's about a year. And then the SAM portion, where we got a different software tool in place to do this modeling, from the time we had a kickoff meeting till I had usable reports, we were done in 5 months. So I put most people probably in the 1.5 to 2 years range. Um, Another question?
Sorry, I lost the audio here myself. I apologize.
Okay.
It looks like we have a poll question. If everyone will take a quick look, and so if you read the live view here, I'd like more information on how Dude Solutions can help me with strategic management. You have 3 choices: a private demonstration, pricing, and all the above. So if you would take a second and select what you would like to put in here, and we will have the results here quickly as we can. All right. All right. Let's give it another minute, another few seconds, actually. And actually, we're kind of running out of time. So let me get to, we have the results that we need, and let's see if I can't get go ahead and get the next question up here. See, I apologize again, I lost the audio. Here we go. Okay, Q&A, here we go. Again, my apologies. This one's for Ashay. I'm saying Ashay. Sorry about that, Ashay. Why do you believe the associations like GFOA, Government Finance Officers Association, are starting to focus on the role of asset management? Ashay?
Primarily to do with the infrastructure deficit, and very much follows what happened in Australia, New Zealand, UK, and very recently in Canada, which is now starting to be embedded into the US, is when we go through a phase of infrastructure deficit constantly creeping up, and the amount of money that's being invested becoming scarce, the question does get asked by the CFO or the finance professionals: are we in control of the future? How much money do we need, and can we invest it differently? It gets on the political agenda with assets crumbling, levels of service dropping, in some cases, unfortunately, leading to catastrophes. So for all the very right reasons, finance professional bodies around the world are now asking the question around the valuation, the accurate depreciation, and a more articulated 10-year plan as opposed to a 4-year plan, and pretty much driven by the state of the assets reports, infrastructure report cards, and a genuine desire to be in control of the future. And that blend between engineering and finance, where engineers have the data, have the evidence like Chris was showing, finance have the appetite and a real desire about financial sustainability, leads to a really good outcome where accountanteering, combination of accounting and engineering, really puts power into the strategic asset management planning process and gives us as asset custodians a really good look at the future.
Very good. Let's see here, another question before we move on here. Let's see, here we go. This is an open question again, like the last one. How do you set a metric and a KPI that engages all stakeholders, from executive to the field crew running day to day? Either one of you, Chris or Asay, would answer that question.
I can take that, and then Chris, you can comment as well from a practitioner perspective. So there is no one KPI that caters for everyone, from the community and the politician down to the day-to-day person. Generally, they're broken up into community KPIs and technical KPIs. And the community KPIs are all about providing safe environments, livable cities, having assets that are reliable, ensuring 24/7 portable supply, etc., which are more intangible in nature, often difficult to measure because of perception. What technical KPIs do is then allow the organization to roll them up to a community KPI to get an understanding of, are we actually delivering an outcome? And Chris beautifully explained that from the perspective of, for example, what proportion of my assets will be below a certain risk level. So I'll let Chris comment on that context as well. Chris?
Yeah, our what was on our reports as the priority score, but essentially a consequence of failure score. We're developing that even more so now. Before it was solely technical. It was such that it was scored, let's say, if this asset fails, is there consequential damage? If it fails, is there a code issue? Those types of questions that play into the risk. And then what we're building out now is actually a strategic side to that score as well that's answered at the building level. This particular building, does it fit the department's mission anymore? Is it substitutable in terms of, can some other building serve the function that it has should it go down? What are its operating expenses compared to its peers? Those types of things. But yeah, with facilities, it's kind of interesting and difficult to develop a level of service definition compared to something like the utilities. For the utilities, a pipe either works or it doesn't, more or less. But in a building, there's multitudes of components, and everyone who walks into it is going to have a different expectation or view of what's acceptable or nice. So it's a little bit of a challenge, but if you develop kind of a technical and a strategic side to your score, you can have a good chance of addressing all those topics.
Great. Listen, we are right at the top of the hour, and which is close enough to say I'm running out of time here. We'd like to thank, I'd personally like to thank Ashay and Chris for their excellent presentations. Also like to thank Dude Solutions for making today's webinar possible. Note that if we didn't answer your question, the speakers will respond to you personally. As a reminder, you're going to receive a follow-up email that will include a link to view today's recording. If you found the event useful, please share that link with your colleagues. At the end of the event, which is a few seconds away, a short survey will pop up in your browser window. We'd appreciate it if you'd share your feedback for this event. Your response will help us create the most interesting and useful content for you. Finally, all of us, every one of us, would like to thank you for your time, your most valuable asset. This is Bill Wolpin, and we look forward to seeing you at the next American City and County webinar.